Hey everyone, this is the conclusion from Trotskyism. This is the conclusion from Peter Beilharz's book, Trotskyism, and the Transition to Socialism. I'm reading this out of order, so I don't know when this will be up, but it'll be up. It's in a separate piece, and it'll say. I guess I'll put it up as probably something like uh, Peter Beilharz's Trotskyism and its outcome. Okay, so here we go. Trotskyism is reconciled with, quote, actually existing, end quote, socialism as the epicenter of the world revolution moves east. Transition in the West is forsaken. The mass audience of Trotskyism shrinks as that of Stalinism expands. The bazaar shifts eastward, following business. Yet this logic, popularized by Deutscher and widely influential throughout the Fourth International, is ultimately self-defeating, if not dangerous outright, because self-destructive. Quote, socialism, end quote, can now be introduced from above by unconscious agents. Mao, Tito, Castro, the Sandinistas, chosen by permanent revolution, in capital letters, or by, quote, capital H, history itself. The necessitarian philosophy of history, developed by Trotsky and extended by Deutscher, explains the tragic spectacle in which Trotskyists must themselves defend their own mortal enemies. If Stalinism is revolutionary, then Trotskyists must kneel before history. Orthodox Trotskyists thus defend to this day the regime which murdered their leader, as they defend regimes like Castro's which suppressed the Cuban Trotskyists, seizing their printing press and smashing, ironically, the type of the local edition of Permanent Revolution. There's a endnote marked there, but I'm not gonna jump ahead to the endnotes. But I guess I should just say when there's an endnote. Um, Even if I'm not reading it until the end. If the conscious enemies of Trotskyism can thus become its unconscious world executors, so then can Trotskyists become obstacles in history's way. If, as Pablo and Deutscher argued, there were two major camps, communism and imperialism, then there was always the risk that Trotskyists might become the indirect instrument of other classes. End note there. Such is the outcome of Trotskyism. The Trotskyist philosophy of history allows no option. If capital H history chooses an agent other than the Fourth International to do capital H history's bidding, then this chosen agent must ultimately represent the best interest of the theory of capital P permanent revolution. Trotskyists must accept and celebrate the judgments of capital H history, even B, the judgment of capital H history against the Trotskyists. Not all Trotskyists have followed this position through to its liquidationist conclusions. Those who have empathized more with the willful Jacobinism of the Bolshevik tradition have refused the ruse. Trotskyism remained a variegated discourse, held together by notions of necessity, whether Bolshevik or not. But all Trotskyists accept the Hegelian principle that capital H history is the world's court of judgment. Those closer to the Bolshevik tradition are simply waiting for more Petrograds. Those who view the proletariat as inessential to the plot see permanent revolution as being vindicated through the world using other, quote, materials, end quote. Modern Trotskyism is a pathic spectacle. Contemporary Trotskyists argue endlessly about the new form Jacobinism might take while they are frog-marched away by the carnal representatives of Behemoth. This is a qualitatively new form of tragedy for the movement. Trotsky's own trajectory was certainly tragic. Trotsky's personal suffering and integrity ought never be forgotten. There's an end here that I'm not reading now. Yet Trotsky submitted to the process of tragedy. The role of will in this implotment remains unrecognized. Marxists seem to need tragic figures, but can they afford mass suicides? Trotsky, at least, was prepared to stand against capital H history. Trotsky believed after 1917 that history could only make contact via the party. Trotsky's hyper-Bolshevism mediated the theory of permanent revolution, while the theory of permanent revolution ultimately made the party obsolete. Trotsky's ambivalence toward the Soviet Union meant that Stalin had to destroy Trotsky. Modern Trotskyists are more obliging. Modern Trotskyists are prepared to open the process themselves if it helps capital H history work out. The language of necessity in Trotskyism turns the theory of permanent revolution into a language of reconciliation. In contemporary Trotskyism, the rhetoric of revolution in the West coexists with the language of reconciliation in the East. Trotsky's work was dominated by the language of Jacobin revolution. The elements of a language of reconciliation in his work were related only to the Soviet experience. In contemporary Trotskyism, the priorities have been reversed. Trotsky, by comparison, did at least allow the possibility that the socialist experiences of the 20th century may have been mere experiments. Trotsky also indicated that if his view of the epoch was mistaken, he would call for a new minimum program defending not the regimes, but the regime's victims. The dominance of the language of necessity in the Fourth International threatens to eclipse not only the libertarian, but even the humanist dimension of Trotsky's thinking. Trotskyist orthodoxy today lacks the contradictory characteristic of Trotsky's own work. It also lacks the sincerity of revolutionary conviction which led Trotsky to dedicate his life to the cause of socialism. Yet the continuity of the Trotskyist tradition remains substantial. Trotskyism functions as theodicy or eschatology, the purpose of which is the intellectual recruitment of the audience through language. The transition to socialism, presumed by Trotskyism in its very vocabulary, has simply been rerouted. This vocabulary, it has been argued here, is, as Arendt observed, the vocabulary of Jacobinism, flow, necessity, masking, gangrene, the lawful and irresistible, the power of necessity. There's an endnote here I'm not reading now. As Arendt observes, the Jacobin notion of the popular movement, les peuples, or people, I don't know how to say that. I guess I could just look it up. What am I doing? Get all modern conveniences here, and I'm not utilizing them. What is wrong with me? And plus, this is actually a super common word that I always stumble upon.
Le peuple. Le peuple.
Poop.
Le peuple.
Popla.
Peuple. Peuple.
Popla. A popla. Indicated a I don't know if I'm fucking even saying that right. Le popla, or if the computer's saying it right. Indicates a multi-headed, as Arendt observes, the Jacobin notion of the popular movement, le peuple, or popple, indicates a multi-headed monster, a mass that moves as one body and acts as though possessed by one will. And as Frey adds, Frey is lived from 1927 to 1997, was a French historian and president of the Saint-Simon Foundation, best known for his books on the French Revolution from 1985 to 1997. Frey was professor of French history at the University of Chicago. Frey was elected to the Académie Française, in March 1997, just 3 months before he died in July. And as Frey adds, the papu, is not only an amoebic but also a carnivorous concept, devouring individuals, identifying enemies as those who remain concealed. In the Marxist tradition, the pupu, God, I gotta listen to that again.
Le peuple.
Le peuple.
Le peuple.
Le peuple.
Le peuple.
Le peuple. Peuple. Le peuple is not only an amoebic but also a carnivorous concept of varying individuals and identifying enemies as those who remain concealed. There's an endnote here that in the Marxist tradition of le peuple becomes le proletariat. In its Trotskyist caricature, le proletariat becomes, in organizational terms, le parti, while the image of, quote, mass, end quote, activity becomes rhetoric, a principle of historiography. The language and message of Trotskyism can thus be seen as an extension of Jacobinism, if with a technological twist, for Trotskyist images of the future are not only naturalistic, but also technological. Trotskyist orthodoxy combines claims to the recovery of naturalism with claims for the desirability of social engineering. Veritably, as Deutscher had it, Trotskyism is the Jekyll and Hyde of the socialist tradition. Jacobinism is here modified by dialectical materialism, mediated by technical rationality. The unity of opposites make everything possible, provided the mole eventually gets it right. The tension between will and necessity absent from Lenin, in Arendt's understanding, remains constant in Trotskyism, though later Trotskyist arguments minimize it. Trotskyism highlights its internal tension between will and necessity in the periodic divisions in the movement over different historical developments. Jacobinism draws it toward necessity. The book, The Transitional Program, not like the actual transition program, the specific transitional program of the Trotskyist movement, which remains the basic orienting device of Trotskyism, identifies the main problem as that of will, but within the context of necessity. Developments after the Second World War produced debates within Trotskyism over questions such as the nature of Eastern Europe and the Chinese, Cuban, Algerian, Vietnamese, and Central American revolutions, all of which prompt divided responses. Either workers' estates have been brought into objective existence despite the intentions of Stalinist leaderships, or else these sociological mutants are viewed as the results of an absence of will, the working class, or the Trotskyist party. Theorists like Deutscher, Bruno Ricci, James Burnham, and the early Michel Pablo epitomize the first response, as they raise objectivism to the level of first principle, viewing socialism or collectivism as an inner principle of an evolving universal history. Others like James and Dunayevskaya, Shachtman and Cliff advance the argument that socialism could only be viewed as a consciously willed process. The source of this tension between subjective and objective dimensions is to be found in Trotsky's own work. Trotskyism as a tradition has never reconciled this dualism, because it is its motivating force, providing the mechanism which allows Trotskyists always to be correct, blaming or accrediting subjective or objective factors as circumstances necessitate. It is this dualism which underlies the Trotskyist proclivity to combine the irreconcilable and to engage constant acts of volte-face. Or volte-face, I'm not sure how you say that. Let's see.
Volte-face.
Volte-face. Volte-face. Where am I going? Is the dualism which underlies the Trotskyist proclivity is this dualism which underlies the Trotskyist proclivity to combine the irreconcilable and to engage constant acts of volte-face. Dualism continues to structure the debate in the Fourth International, even if its power is muted. Contemporary Trotskyism becomes a language of reconciliation to the extent that Trotskyism fails to maintain this dualism. Necessity, then, has a powerful appeal for Trotskyism. In this regard, it can be said that Trotskyism is more directly formed by the Second International than by Marx's own theory. That seems absolutely correct. Trotskyists typically espouse some variant of the 1859 preface, productive forces being viewed as the motor of history. Evolutionary arguments like those of Mandel clearly privilege, quote, objective, end quote, developments in the manner of Karl Kautsky, and this despite the separate argument about the need for a proletarian vanguard. Other arguments like those of Dunayevskaya or James subscribe to an epistemological automatism, viewing the maturity of the age or the self-development of the proletariat as the condition for socialism, while people like Deutscher view progress as something inscribed into industrialization and enculturation. Regardless of whether they privilege, quote, subjective, end quote, or, quote, objective tendencies, all these Trotskyist arguments remain fundamentally teleological. They tell us something about the desire for socialism, but little of its conditions of possibility. Trotskyism develops within intellectual parameters which allow Trotskyism the structural and linguistic scope to elaborate an associational logic and a vocabulary appropriate to it, so that associations are constantly generated in a cosmological or historiosophical manner. This is as true of libertarians like James and Dunayevskaya as it is for Jacobins like Mandel and Deutscher. The constellations of associations struck up by James and Dunayevskaya refer to the subjective component in Trotskyism, to the element of mass spontaneous will formation and organization, and to the philosophical expression of this dialectic of freedom, understood as manifesting the inner self movement of things in the sense that history is the actualization of menschlicher Geist. James and Dunayevskaya add to history a philosophical layer of myth, effectively ascribing everyday life a profound philosophical significance. Texts become analogues for the commonplace. The commonplace becomes cosmological. Houses become dialectical for James. Philosophical texts become anticipations of third world leaders or union bureaucrats for Dunayevskaya. The constellations of associations set up by Mandel and Deutscher are complex in different ways. Mandel's language is structured by the vocabulary of necessity, understood as the objective evolution of world history through successive modes of production or technological revolutions. Like the later Trotsky, Mandel interprets the subjective factor as identical with the party and views the party as the ethereal component of will injected into this objective process. Deutscher's constellation of language is even more strictly circumscribed by a sense of necessity, which is geared to a sense of progress understood less as a theory of successive modes than as a theorem that human and industrial progress is achieved through barbarism. Of all the Trotskyist arguments considered in this study, Deutscher seems to be the most complex and arguably the most persuasive, for the layers of meaning in his constellation are reference to signification in classical tragedy and mythology, as well as Shakespearean and Faustian notions of action, the Victorian senses of progress and pessimism in the manner of Macaulay and Carlyle. Deutscher remains intriguing to the extent that Deutscher actually combines Macaulay and Carlyle, Prometheus and Sisyphus. Mandel's associations are unimpressive compared to Deutscher's, relating mainly to cruder images of geological or anthropological evolution, to senses of crisis and intervention in subterranean action. Mandel's vocabulary is reminiscent of Trotsky at his worst, while Deutscher resembles, perhaps even surpasses, Trotsky at his historical best. The constant tension towards subjective and objective elements in Mandel's work mirrors Trotsky's own position more directly than any other argument considered here. For the scope given to freedom rather than necessity is sufficient to justify the existence of the Fourth International, while simultaneously allowing support for each and any, quote, progressive, end quote, development in the emergence of new deformed, quote, worker states, end quote. Deutscher's thought, however, remains more influential because of the extent to which the Fourth International is now increasingly tied to these regimes. The constellations struck up by Mandel and Deutscher now throw considerable light on the intricacies and contradictions of Trotsky's own work. The philosophical cosmology established by James and Dunayevskaya, like their libertarian politics, shows only a passing relation to what is conventionally called Trotskyism. It is their interpretation of East European societies which reveals the stronger point of contact with Trotsky and the tradition. In this regard, it can be observed that if the state capitalist argument produces better results than arguments like those of Mandel or Deutscher, it is because the associations invoked are more appropriate. Addressing not the historic vocation of the proletariat or the superior value of central planning, but the more earthly questions of what it means to be a, quote, worker in a worker's state, end quote. Mandel and Deutscher also modified Trotsky, but they do so in a way which is more substantively reflective of the inner dynamic of Trotskyist thought. This development is particularly evident in their extension of Trotsky's Jacobinism. Probably neither Deutscher nor Mandel would concede the point. Lenin seems to have been the only Marxist who is prepared to publicly view Jacobinism as a virtue, and then only in passing. A defining characteristic of Trotskyist Jacobinism is its self-refusal. Trotskyist Jacobinism cannot recognize itself as Jacobin. It is itself tragic, in political terms, because Trotskyist Jacobinism refuses to recognize the inner contradiction between the project of human perfectibility and the practice of social engineering conducted from above. Trotskyist Jacobinism refuses to accept that within its own language, the tension in Jacobinism is that between freedom and necessity. While Bolshevism has proven to be a historically tragic project of action, social democracy has meantime proven to be a historically indecisive project of inaction. Though bankrupt, revolutionary and reformist languages are still remain dominant in radical discourse, perhaps the more so because they share some basic articles of vocabulary. Allegiance to central planning from above, chief among them. The problem of social change or transition in the West needs to be faced in the light of this situation. Marx argued more than a century ago that the poetry of revolution had to be created from the future, not the past. Marx did not explain how this might be possible, nor did he develop a political language adequate to its discussion. Jacobinism filled the void. As a result, Marxism today has no practical language for a transition to socialism. In the 20th century, there are simply too many dead for the dead to bury. Trotskyism, however noble, however defiant, is part of the past. The traditions of its dead generations continue to weigh like a nightmare on the minds of the living. Okay, so that's the end of the piece. And their end notes are not really end notes, they're just citations, but I'll say this what's being cited. The first citation is Robert J. Alexander, whose pieces I have all over this channel. His book, which I believe is his first book, maybe I'm wrong about that, Trotskyism in Latin America. And two, the next citation is a piece by Pablo titled From the Third to the Fourth World Congress, Towards a History of the Fourth International. That's from Towards a History of the Fourth International, excuse me. the third is a piece by a G. Steiner titled, this is an essay or a journal article titled, quote, Trotsky and the Tragic Imagination, end quote. And fourth is Hannah Arendt on Revolution, and E. Pankow, Social Movement, an article called Social Movement in the journal Economy and Society from 1982. And the final note is on Arendt's book On Revolution and Fauré's book Interpreting the French Revolution. So, thanks for listening. I appreciate it.